When I applied to college, one of the missions counselors asked me a routine question, but an important question. It was a small office in one of these historic campus administration buildings, and it had dark wood wainscoting on the sides, kind of like this, this dark wood wainscoting in the room, and nice sort of plaster walls. The carpet was red. It's kind of like the sanctuary, but imagine it more like an office. And it had these very warm lamps in the corners and bookcases filled with books from floor to ceiling. And I was very intimidated. It felt like a very significant room. You know what I'm talking about? One of those significant rooms. And the chair I was sitting in was made out of solid wood. The desk right there was a solid wood desk, that was handmade. You could tell it was probably 100 years old. And the questions that were being asked were, the basic questions. Why do you want to come to this school? Things like, what do you want to do with your life? But then the final question that the counselor asked me was a question that I still remember because I kind of biffed it in the interview. She asked me, tell me the top 3 things about you that are most important. Tell me the top 3 things about you that are most important. And I kind of biffed it. That's like a classic question, but it's so classic, I hadn't thought that they'd actually ask it, you know what I mean? And so I biffed it. I sort of stumbled through that question. I mean, it worked out okay. I got in. But it's one of those questions, right? What's the most important thing about you? That it's good to reflect on, even if you're not in the middle of a college application process. It's not just a question to be asked about in an interview, but a question good to ask for your own soul and for your own spirit. What's the most important thing about you? What are the most important things about you? What do you hold as the most important things about you? So it's worth asking this morning. What's the most important thing about you? What's the most important thing about you? Perhaps the most important thing about you is your vocation or your job, the way you make a living. Maybe it's your role in the family. You're the paterfamilial, you're the matriarch, you're the center of gravity that kind of holds your family together. Maybe you take pride in your character. You have an upstanding character that you've worked to cultivate. Your generosity with the change jar, right? Helping others. Maybe it's a skill you've developed. You're really good at doing something specific. Maybe it's your creativity or your grit or your intellect. The Christian writer A.W. Tozer can help us with this exercise. Anybody heard the name A.W. Tozer before? I see some hands. A.W. Tozer, he was a writer and a theologian in the Christian Missionary Alliance denomination. And would you believe it, he grew up relatively close to here. He grew up about 90 minutes north and east of Ligonier by car, north of Evansburg in a little town called La Josie. Maybe I'm pronouncing that wrong, but it's so small, I can't find a place on the internet to tell me how to pronounce it. It's like 83 people. It's not a big town. So he grew up not too far from here, and he ended up becoming a widely read Christian writer. His most famous works, maybe you've heard of them, called The Pursuit of God and The Knowledge of the Holy. He was very popular between 1940 and 1965. Many of his books are still in print, although he has since gone to be with Jesus. But in the book, The Knowledge of the Holy, A.W. Tozer he introduces the book with this phrase. He says this: what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Let me say that again. A.W. Tozer suggests that what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Right? In other words, right, our understanding of God, the God we sort of see and understand in our mind's eye, the God we reflect upon when we get together to worship on Sunday, right? How we understand God, that's the most important thing about us. And all of our life and our character and our behavior and our passions and our relationships, according to Tozer, they're all sort of outflows of this core, deeper question of what do we think about when we think about God? And the Apostle Paul would have agreed with A.W. Tozer. And we know this because of what he writes in our reading today from Colossians. And so this idea of what do we think about when we think about God, it's going to be our theme for a couple of weeks here. We're going to spend time together in the letter of Colossians. It's going to be where we focus our sermon time in the weeks to come. Because we at Epiphany, we're to spend times there. It's one of Paul's letters, and it's one of these interesting letters where Paul writes to a church he doesn't even know. That Paul writes to some churches that he helped plant and helped start, and he writes to churches that he's visited and spent time with. But Paul has never been to this church in Colossae, which is in modern-day Turkey. And in fact, it's his buddy Epaphras. Janice, I understand it's one of those Bible names. I'm with you. His buddy Epaphras is actually the one who started that church, right? But he starts this church, and Paul's never been there, but Paul's hearing about this church and the work that they're doing, and Paul's going to write them a letter. And what Paul wants to do when he writes this letter is he wants to sort of get down to brass tacks about the most important things about being a Christian. And in fact, Paul's writing this. He's writing this from prison. It's one of these letters that Paul pens while he's in prison awaiting trial in Rome. In the ancient world, preaching the gospel could get you in trouble. Talking about the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, it could get you in trouble. It got Paul in trouble. It made him lots of enemies. He's in prison. And while he's awaiting trial, he's writing letters to a lot of the churches. The churches are going, hey, Paul, you okay? You're in jail. Should we freak out? And Paul says, no. Don't freak out. I'm in jail. It's okay. If Jesus was crucified, I can be in jail for a little while. And so Paul is writing to this church. And if you read our reading today, this introduction, when you look at the reading, the key sort of theme of the book of Colossians is brought forward. We might get a little tripped up because these letters were written in Greek and we don't speak Greek. They've been translated into English. And when they get translated into English, sometimes the grammarians amongst us will say, that is a run-on sentence, and you are correct. That is a run-on sentence in the English. It's not in the Greek. But if you look through in this sort of complicated reading, you'll find that there's a lot Paul has to say about wisdom and understanding and learning. Paul talks about how great it was that from the very beginning, the Colossians learned and heard and understood the gospel in its purest and most correct form. And you can go through and find that language of understand and wisdom. The church in Colossae, they get it. The Colossians get it. And their faith is bearing fruit, and their faith community is bearing fruit from that faith. It's not just that they believe Jesus died and rose from the dead, and that they've been transferred, as our reading says, from the kingdom of darkness into his marvelous light, and their sins have been forgiven. It's that they're living a life together like they actually believe it. It's manifesting in their day-to-day relationships. And to get this, I want to zoom in on one particular little part of our reading. About halfway through the reading, Paul lets them know about his prayers. Paul says, I don't know you, I haven't met you, but I've heard about you from Epaphras. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you how I'm praying for you. Because I'm praying for you. And here's what Paul says. He says, from the day we heard about you as a church, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. So in that little bitty bit right there where Paul is saying, I'm praying for you, and here's what I'm praying for, what is it that Paul prays for? He says, I want you to have wisdom, I want you to have understanding, I want you to have knowledge. I want you to have wisdom and understanding and knowledge about who God is and what the Christian life is about. I want you to grow in your knowledge of God. He says, because if you can get to know God really well, and you understand what happened in Jesus' death and resurrection, and you sort of study that and integrate it into your heart, well, the result of that is going to be that you're going to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. So he doesn't just want the church to sort of, he doesn't pray, I really pray that you guys would behave. I really pray that you guys would shape up. I really pray that you guys would just be good, you know. He actually prays and says, no. I want you to understand in the depth of your soul what God has done for you through Jesus' death and resurrection. I'm praying that you know it better, because once you know it better, you're going to walk in a manner worthy of his calling. And this sort of dual nature of you learn it, and the more you learn it, the better you walk, and then the better you walk, the more you're learning, this sort of upward spiral of growth in faith. That's what Paul wants for this church that he has yet to meet. In other words, to use Tozer's language, the most important thing for the church in Colossae is to understand God and know him properly. Because if they can understand God and know him properly, then the sort of outflow of that into their lives will be logical and almost automatic. If you understand who God is and what God has done, everything else will form around that. In other words, the most important thing about you is what you think about when you think about God. To go back to that Tozer quote. We need to get God right before we get the other stuff that goes with it. We need to understand the gospel so that we can therefore then begin to act out the implications of the gospel in our everyday life. So what is the most important thing about you? To go back to Tozer, what's the most important thing about you? The most important thing about you is what comes to mind when you think about God. Because your vision of that ultimate reality and who God is and what he has done for you, that is what's going to translate and bleed out into every single other element of your life. And so I think Tozer is right. I think he's channeling what St. Paul says to the church in Colossae. The most important thing about you is what you think about when you think about God. But that isn't what the world says, is it? Right? We do live in the world, and not everyone would agree with that sentiment. We live in a world where the most important thing about you is something completely different than what you think about when you think about God. In fact, I would say a lot of our problems today are a lot of the public conversations we are having, the things that we disagree about the most in society. It's because we don't understand who God is, and we have this idea that something else besides God is the most important. And that's the core of a lot of our social unrest that we see. You know, because like according to some people in the world, the most important thing about us, the most important thing about you, it's not what you think about when you think about God. The most important thing about you is maybe like your nationality or your race or your skin color. And if you believe that someone's nationality is the most important thing about them, or their race, their skin color, you become very concerned with like land and borders and immigration, and you become mistrustful of people that aren't like you. And like, I get it. There's like secular geopolitical realities that mandate a lot of what we talk about when we talk about nations and states and those higher level things. But as a Christian, we disagree. We don't think somebody's nationality is the most important thing about them. We simply can't. Right? I mean, culturally speaking, right, because you're in church this morning and because you are here in some professing way of saying, I am a Christian, right, you have more in common with Christians throughout the world than you do with a lot of people that live on your street and live in your neighborhood. Right? If there's a church growing, single woman in Nigeria, or if there's a family going to church in Ecuador, or if there are Christians in the Middle East who are meeting in a little house church, between customs and values and your understanding of reality, right, you probably have more in common with them than you do people who live in town. And so as Christians, right, we say that no, it's this nationality question. It's not the most important thing. Because what does nationality define? It defines, where you live and some customs and some, how much you pay in taxes and whose military defends you, I guess. But like, that's about it. That's very surface level stuff. And it comes to the deep stuff. What we believe transcends national boundaries. And so, no, we cannot say that our nationality or our race or our skin color is the most important thing about us. Others say in the world today, the most important thing about us is how we look. If we are beautiful, handsome, healthy, blessed with good genetics, that's the most important thing about us. And if you believe that a person's looks are the most important thing about them, well, you'll be shocked by many things in life, right? First, you'll be shocked to realize that good looks are, of course, only skin deep, and that people can have fantastic looks and terrible character and personalities, right? You can look beautiful and you can look healthy and you can look fit. And on the inside, you are, as Jesus says, a whitewashed tomb. You're just dead and useless inside. So you'll recognize that. And then second, you'll recognize that, beautiful people age and how their bodies grow old. And you'll recognize that the standards of beauty that we hold for people in their 20s or whatever that looks like, it doesn't mean anything when you reach higher ages in life. That there's more to life to be lived because the standards of beauty for youth and beauty just don't last. The third thing you'll recognize is that if you believe that the most important thing about you is your good looks and your health, well, then what's going to happen is that as you get older and you see the wrinkles and the gray hairs and the bad knees, you're going to take those not just as signs of age, but you're going to take that as an existential crisis. You spend thousands of dollars on plastic surgery, and you'll go through these processes to find more and more cosmetic solutions, and it just becomes this rat chasing its tail. It's this task of Sisyphus to try to keep aging at bay. And we as Christians, we are big fans of remembering our mortality. That this body will not be the body we take with us into heaven. We are to get new bodies. And we don't put our hopes in our bodies and our looks and our health because, like our reading said today, right? There's the guy who had all this wealth and all this benefit to his life, and God says, "You fool, your soul will be demanded of you tomorrow." And so this sense of beauty and age and health and vitality being the most important thing about you, I mean, yeah, like let's take care of our bodies together, but let's not make it the ultimate thing. It's just not the most important thing. Another thing people say, what's the most important thing about you today? It's money. How much money do we have? How much money is in the savings account and your retirement next egg? How much money, how's money going to insulate you from all these problems in life? They talk about squirreling away as much as they can for the future. And related to this is the idea that the most important thing about you is your economic viability. Right? Having a marketable set of skills and knowledge base to make us hireable in the market. They say that's the most important thing about you. And we have all sorts of teachings today. I don't know if you caught that. That was the theme of some of our other readings, but saying, wealth, I mean, it's a fool's errand. Ecclesiastes says, it's all vanity. I've done it all. I've tried it all. I'm here to report back to you. It doesn't mean a thing. And our psalm today was all about, people sort of, the rich being rich and getting rich, and people saying, well, that's not fair that the people of bad character get to be rich, but I'm going to trust in God anyway. And our reading from Jesus' gospel, our gospel reading today was of the same ilk. In the sense that wealth is the most important thing, that being in the marketplace and being useful to other people. The Bible goes so far as to say that money is a false god. It gives it the name Mammon. And the question is whether your money exists for your own selfish ends or whether you're going to use the funds that you have to love God and love your neighbor. And so there's this wider question of the society that says, well, the most important thing about you is how much money you've accumulated and how much wealth you have. And the Bible says it's absolutely not true. We can keep going. What's the most important thing about you? Is it your political party affiliation? Is it whether you're the victim of an unjust society or whether you're a supporter of that unjust society, whether you're a victim or you're part of the victimized? Others say the most important thing about you is where you live, whether you're married and you have kids, how many kids you have, what kind of car you drive, what kind of clothes you wear, what's your opinion about the Israel-Palestine war? And at some level, when we know all these things, we know that all these things are meaningless. We know they're not of primary importance. That doesn't necessarily mean we have the answer to our question. What's the most important thing about you? Well, we can come up with a list from here to here and just scribble in all the things that are not the most important things about us. But the question becomes, well, what is the most important thing about you? And it's like, well, what do we then write positively over here? And this is where we need to go back to Paul. We need to go back to the scriptures. We need to take their insights that Tozer distilled for us and say, the most important thing about us is what we think about when we think about God. The most important thing about us is the thing we think about when we think about God, because that bleeds out into all these other aspects of life over here. And when we get our understanding of the gospel correct, then we begin, as Paul said in our reading, to start to walk in a manner worthy of our Lord. And so, friends, it's worth asking this morning, What do you think about when you think about God? What do you think about when you think about God? What comes to mind? Is God some sort of benevolent sky father who gives you nice things from time to time? Is God an angry boss who tosses down the smites upon the people he's mad at? Is God the sort of cosmic watchmaker who set everything at motion and wound it all up like a old school clock and then stepped back and is sort of distant and inactive and just sort of watching how it all plays out? Is God the author of a rule book who, if you just follow his rules from A to Z, then you'll have a happy and fulfilled life and go to heaven? Is God the cheerleader who seems to justify and approve of all your strong moral opinions in life? Because if you believe that God is any of those things, it's wrong. That's not who God is at all. The whole of the scriptures, the testimony of the saints from the past, God is so much bigger and better than anything like that. None of those represent the God that Paul wants us to consider as we work our way through Colossians. And the joy of this small book that we're going through is that uniquely Paul is going to help us understand in the weeks to come the true nature of God, the true nature of his love and mission in the gospel, and how it transforms our everyday life. It's going to transform, Paul says, our family life, our work life, our relationships with people who are different than us, our relationships with people who are similar to us. It's going to transform our thoughts about money, about time. It's going to take all of those ideas and flip them on their head. Because once you understand God as he reveals himself through Jesus' death and resurrection, the whole world turns upside down. And, you get to be turned upside down in relationship to the world as well. And that's when you can start to walk in a manner worthy of God's calling. And so, friends, what you think about when you think about God, I think it's the most important thing about you. Let's take the next few weeks to ask ourselves that question. In fact, it may be the most important thing that we ask ourselves and the core of who we are as human beings. So it's worth spending some time discussing, and we'll pick up our conversation next week. In Jesus' name, amen.